Welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thank you for coming to our first lecture of the calendar year as we start the spring semester. Glad to see what I think are so many new faces. For those of you, I'll just make a few housekeeping announcements if you haven't been here before. Brookings Mountain West is a partnership between UNLV and the Brookings Institution, the well-known public policy think tank, headquartered in Washington, D.C. As we like to say, that's the eastern branch of Brookings Mountain West. And we are delighted to bring many of our colleagues out. We'll have a series of 8 or 9 lectures this semester. We have a printed schedule outside. Please pick that up if that's useful to you. Or you can visit our website and let us know if you'd like to receive email announcements or get on our Facebook page, or I will tweet you to death if you care to communicate that way. But again, thanks for coming. We are delighted to have colleague Vanda Felbab-Brown here from Brookings and the Foreign Policy Program. Most specifically, Vanda is a senior fellow with the Center for at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. And so in her role as a Brookings scholar, her expertise lies in the field of international conflicts, counterinsurgency, organized crime, and illicit economies, something we may be slightly familiar with here in Las Vegas. But Vanda looks at very serious issues on a global scale. And one of her areas of expertise is Afghanistan, as you might guess by the topic of her lecture tonight. I wish we could have her speak on all of those topics, but we'll have her back hopefully to address some of those others. But we have a very timely topic tonight on Afghanistan as that war winds down. For those of you who saw the State of the Union last night, it was a topic there. And we can discuss that and many other issues as Vanda's talk. She is, like many scholars, is here this week spending time in UNLV classes, both undergraduate and graduate, meeting with individual students and faculty, and is here tonight to speak to us. She mentioned to me she spent, I think it was 21 of the last 24 months, more or less, on the road doing her field work, and not like some of us who consider going to the library field work for research. Vanda's in Afghanistan, Somalia, and many other parts of the world that, by anyone's definition, would be considered troublesome, if not dangerous. So we're especially delighted that she's here and safe with us tonight. Vanda?
Good evening. Thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction. And it's been just a delight to come to Vegas and spend time with the community here. I loved your phrasing, the eastern branch of Brookings West. I wholeheartedly agree and could be easily persuaded that Las Vegas and the University of Nevada in Las Vegas should in fact become the headquarters of Brookings. It's been very rewarding to see the engagement and interest of the community here in issues that can be so insular in Washington, that can so preoccupy us that we lose track of how we who advise policymakers and policymakers themselves need to listen to the voices of people who are engaged in these same issues, but from often different perspectives and different areas. And so it's a delight, again, to spend the evening with you today and the week here as part of the Brookings Mountain West project. And I look forward to having opportunities to come back, perhaps to sample Las Vegas illicit economies in different forms. Bill, you mentioned that some of the issues that I work on, and of course Afghanistan is a place where conflict, illicit economies, difficult diplomacy, geostrategic relations all come together as almost in no other place. And it is a place where the United States military has been engaged in what is now the longest war, where much of blood and treasure has been sacrificed. on the part of the United States, but where also the Afghan people have lived and existed through some most excruciating conditions for decades on, even as they hope for a better future. In his rather moving speech yesterday, I thought President Obama started with the war in Afghanistan. In fact, it surprised me that that was his opening sentence. But of course, what didn't surprise me and what was the thrust of his opening sentence was that the war in Afghanistan is winding down, that we are bringing the war in Afghanistan to a close, something that the president has made his key objective. But the reality, of course, is that the war in Afghanistan is not coming to a close. In fact, Afghanistan's future is very precarious. What is perhaps coming to a close is the US direct participation in the war. But it is hardly determined, as you will hear in my talk, that Afghanistan will be a stable, peaceful place, perhaps a prosperous place after 2014, in 2015, when the majority, if not all, of US troops will have departed, and likely all of NATO troops as well. And it's not at all clear that the aspirations of the Afghan people will be in any way met. And there are still many things that the United States can do, that the international community can do, but nonetheless the future is hanging on a thread. What was also very striking to me about President Obama's talk yesterday was, in fact, the uncertainty of what kind of engagement we will have in Afghanistan after 2014. The president said that if a bilateral security agreement is signed between the United States and Afghanistan, then a small force, I didn't say how large a force, a small force of US soldiers would stay on and be engaged in two limited missions. One is the primary reason why the United States became involved in Afghanistan in 2001, counterterrorism operation. And the second is a mission that's critical for enabling that first mission, namely training the Afghan security forces. But here we are at the beginning of 2013, less than 11 months are left to when the US mission and NATO mission are supposed to expire, and we still don't know whether any troops and how many troops will stay in the country. Now, what is even more surprising to us is that the reason why we don't have greater clarity is not because of our decision-making processes, but in fact, as a result of the reluctance of the Afghan government led by President Hamid Karzai to sign a bilateral security agreement. Now, given that I stated that Afghanistan's future is hanging on a thread, and that our part in the war might be winding down, but hardly the war itself is winding down, why is it that the Afghan president would be reluctant to sign a bilateral security agreement that would enable us to continue providing assistance to his forces or to the forces of Afghanistan, of the Afghan government? Well, that is a question that is indeed puzzling and preoccupying decision makers in Washington, who frankly had no anticipation that President Karzai would become so difficult a partner in a way that we can even question whether he is a partner. And indeed, a man who was once hailed as a hero of Afghanistan, who was wined and dined in the White House, who attended one of the State of the Union speeches in the President Bush administration, is now essentially seen as a pariah in the international system. Just last week, he suggested that the United States is in fact assisting the Taliban, that it doesn't want the war to come to an end. In fact, suggested that some terrorist attacks might have the participation of the United States in a manner that is both appalling, shocking, morally intolerable, as well as highly pernicious in how it encourages the Taliban and how it shapes the larger environment in which US troops have to participate. Now, President Karzai is hopefully not the representative in his views anymore of the larger Afghan people. I think that the vast majority of Afghans are craving for peace, and when President Karzai speaks about the need for peace, I think he is very much reflecting that desire. Where I think he is quite off is in suggesting that perhaps it would not be good for Afghanistan that American troops and NATO soldiers stay there. And when he's dragging his feet on signing the bilateral security agreement. I have, over the past decade, gone to Afghanistan many times, at least once a year, often for several months. And I have seen attitudes of Afghan people evolve from essentially great expectations, hope, and aspirations of the early parts of the decade, including very warm welcome for the United States, toward ambivalence, dissatisfaction, deep disappointment with both the Afghan government and the United States. And people will often complain to me that the war is still so intense, so many people and civilians are dying, predominantly at the hands of the Taliban, which causes the deaths of about 75% of civilian casualties every year. But nonetheless, some civilians also die as a result of US military action, sadly, but inevitably. And who often question, why is it that a superpower that defeated the Taliban within a matter of weeks in the initial 2001 invasion, now faces this protracted, deeply entrenched, highly resilient insurgency, and how it is that this administration or the US government allowed what they call a mafia government to be ruling the country for the past decade. And they often have their own many conspiracy theories, some of which are quite outlandish, and could be only surpassed by their neighbors to the east, Pakistani's conspiracy theories about US involvement there. But nonetheless, even people who resent and are angry with the United States do not want the US to leave. I was last in Afghanistan this summer for a few weeks and got to travel to different parts of the country and had the opportunity to speak with some old friends and acquaintances, and as well as new interlocutors. And just about inevitably, unless the people were direct sympathizers and supporters of the Taliban, I was told that whatever the problems that the US caused, the worst thing the US can now do is to abandon Afghanistan and leave, and not leave any soldiers behind in 2014 to assist. And this even came from people who were deeply angry at the US and who blamed the US for all manner of Afghan problems, some of which are very internally driven. But even they told me that if the US leaves, there will be civil war. And it was certainly not the message that we were hearing from the president in the State of the Union speech yesterday, and it's certainly something that no one in Washington wants to see. And so when as the fall has been unfolding, much of the fall has been consumed by preparation for signing the bilateral security agreement. And I've been in various communications with my Afghan friends, and I can tell you that they are as perplexed as policymakers in Washington about why President Karzai has not signed the bilateral security agreement. At the end of November, he organized what's called the Loya Jirga, essentially a council of various elders, prominent religious clerics, prominent representatives, prominent political power brokers, representatives of the business community, some NGO members, about 3,000 people. And the whole purpose of the group was to meet for several days and deliberate on whether the United States should stay in Afghanistan after 2014. And after several days of deliberation, they had a unanimous verdict: yes, the US should stay. And then President Karzai came on the podium and said, but guess what? I am still not signing. And the leader of the Loya Jirga essentially begged him, Mr. President, you cannot be this selfish. This cannot be about you. We need the Americans to stay with all their troubles and all the bad baggage and problems they brought. And President Karzai said, I will only sign if a variety of new conditions that had not been part of the negotiations are met. So how is it that we got to this very perplexing state where Afghanistan is so vulnerable, and yet it is so beholden to a leader who arguably no longer represents the Afghan people, but who also is so much at odds with Washington? Well, there are many who would tell you that the reason is that we try to do too much in Afghanistan, that we have got bogged down in the equivalent of Vietnam, that we took on a nation-building mission where our purpose should have been solely to destroy the safe havens that allowed Al-Qaeda to strike at U.S. continent, U.S. heartland, and cause the devastation and trauma of 9/11. And that what the problems that have ensued with the entrenched insurgency, with a government that is corrupt and venal, and which produces unpredictable, capricious leaders like President Hamid Karzai, was bound to happen. That Afghans are tribal and not interested in a formal state, that they resent the presence of foreigners, that they want to be left alone to their 19th century ways. And then indeed the right policy now to take is to get out and never repeat such a venture again. It was certainly not the vision of the Obama administration when they came in. In fact, President Obama early on identified Afghanistan as the right war, the neglected war, unlike Iraq. But as time went on, the administration very much grappled with some of these very same statements, some of these very same hypotheses, and really has essentially been torn between whether, if the primary US purpose of intervening in the country is counterterrorism, namely anti-Al-Qaeda operations, does it imply that we have to take on any other mission? Does it matter what kind of governance we leave behind? Similarly, the Bush administration grappled with the questions, and in fact early on made the judgment that this would be an intervention that would be very limited, that would simply blow up the Taliban capture hold on the country, and then would be able to leave very quickly. Now, the Bush administration subsequently realized that things were not so easy, that between simply destroying a regime and leaving in the wake something that is sustainable enough to make the cost of destroying the regime worthwhile and to secure the primary interest, a whole variety of other things had to happen. But nonetheless continue to resource the mission in very limited ways, as most resources focused strategic thinking was focused on Iraq. I wrote a book last year that is called Aspiration and Ambivalence, Strategies and Realities of Counterinsurgency and State Building. And the book in many ways respects my engagement in Afghanistan over the past decade, and watching how counterinsurgency and state building efforts have ensued. And I hope is also reflects the voice of the Afghan people. I have been lucky to be able to go there and interact with them in ways that many of the folks, civilian folks or military folks deployed there could not, because I would be able to travel alone and often be able to interact with them in very sort of unstructured manner. Now, I also can certainly not claim to speak on behalf of the Afghan people. But nonetheless, the central claim of the book is that this notion that Afghans are anti-government, that they don't want an effective central governance, that they want to be left to their medieval or 19th century tribal ways, that they are inherently anti-foreign presence is wrong. And that the reason why, that in fact, just like any peoples anywhere in the world, they want security, human security, physical security from violence, from harm, from crime, security from economic want. They want their children to not starve. They want their children to have access to medical care. But just like people anywhere in the world, they also want accountability from their leaders. And the tragedy of Afghanistan is not that we try to do too much, but that we never did enough, in fact. And most significantly, we underemphasized one aspect of the mission, namely the state-building part. So even when we boosted military presence sufficiently to start at least pushing back against the Taliban insurgency that became entrenched, the weakest aspect of the endeavor was to corral the Afghan government and the power brokers associated with the Afghan government into delivering more efficient, more accountable public good services to the Afghan people. And in fact, at various points, it's simply preventing the level of abuse and rapaciousness and lack of rule of law that come to characterize the country, in which power means that I can show up at your door and say your land is mine, and if you don't give it to me, your children will be kidnapped. Or I can show up with a piece of paper with a fake signature and claim that the land is mine. And of course, much worse than that, there is a tremendous amount of violence, including murders perpetrated by people in power who can get away literally with murder. And to make things worse, many of these power brokers, government officials, were people who we would be relying on in conducting counterinsurgency operations against the Taliban or anti-Al-Qaeda operations. So as I have repeatedly gone into the country, I have often asked people the question, do you like the Taliban? And the answer is always overwhelmingly no. It's also the question that surveys of Afghan people regularly ask. But in many ways, that question is a wrong, irrelevant question. The only question that matters is not, do you like the Taliban in absolute terms, but do you like the Taliban better than the alternative that is available to you? And here the story gets far more complicated. If you talk with Afghans about that, they will say, look, the Taliban was extremely abusive and they destroyed everything. The only thing that was working during the 1990s when they were in power was the opium poppy economy. And we were so happy to get rid of them. When the Americans came in 2001, just about no one sided with the Taliban. We were thrilled to be rid of the plague that the Taliban was. But when they were in power, we could travel from Kandahar, a big city in the south, to Kabul with 1 million rupees, and no one would rob us. Today, when we travel 20 miles just to get to Kandahar from our village or our district, we will pass numerous police checkpoints and have to pay a bribe at each of them. And there is a chance that the Taliban will attack us as well. But if they do, the police doesn't do anything to protect us. We might not be able to sell our crops in Kandahar because the economic market here will be dominated by a power broker. And if I am from a different tribe than the power broker, I will not have access to the economic trade. And you Americans are responsible. Now, it's of course very simplistic to say that the United States is solely responsible or fully responsible. But the United States certainly underemphasized governance in its state-building efforts in Afghanistan very much ambivalent about whether we can prosecute our counterterrorism goals simply by destroying Al-Qaeda safe havens and bombing key Taliban commanders or not. Now, there are many other parts to the Afghanistan story I am happy to explore with you in the question and answer period, such as the deeply complex and problematic role of Pakistan and the geostrategic cauldron in which Afghanistan sits and makes Afghanistan critically dependent on external agreement or disagreement among its neighbors and great powers. Let me just make a few comments about where it is that we are now. 2014 and 2015 is a year of a triple earthquake for Afghanistan. The first part of the earthquake is the security situation, and particularly how much security deteriorates in 2015 when either a very small US contingent or no US military contingent is left in Afghanistan. That depends on several factors. Most importantly, it depends on the state of the Afghan National Security Forces, which we have been trying to build up and strengthen and make effective over the past several years. And clearly there has been an enormous progress. Even just this past year in 2013, when they took over being the primary security providers with NATO very much in the backup, the difference between their ability to operate, plan, take action, respond to Taliban attacks, anticipate Taliban attacks is dramatically different than what it would have been in 2012. And during the past year, in 2013, the Taliban, through tremendous military effort, they launched many attacks and really tried to bloody the nose of the Afghan security forces as much as possible, and they didn't budge. So they didn't cede territory to the Taliban didn't win any major offensives. The forces performed well. But the governance story kicks in again. On the tactical side, on the offensive side, the forces are performing well. When it comes to logistics, the tail side that makes the military move, there's a whole variety of problems with corruption, inefficiency, ethnic patronage. And it turns out that unless you have good friends, your unit has good friends in Kabul, maybe you'll never see any resupply of bullets, winter clothes. Major problem. And on a whole variety of enabling function that on the backup but crucial side that makes the Afghan army or any army function, still massive amount of problems. Now, to some extent, this is not surprising because the planning, NATO planning, our planning, way back in 2009, 2010, when the mission was being structured, was that we would continue providing these enabling functions well past 2014. So, for example, they lack air assets or their asset capacities are very limited. We knew that and we said, well, fine, we'll continue providing medevac function, for example, reconnaissance function. It's now clear that that will not happen. Even if some US military forces left, all of the enablers we had been telling them for years we'll continue providing will not be there. So they're on their own. Second big question is, how will the military be funded? Afghanistan is the second poorest country in the world and probably second most corrupt country in the world. It's only North Korea and Somalia who are either more corrupt or poorer and more destroyed. And its economy essentially exists on, with some facetiousness, half on drugs and half on foreign aid. For any of you who have run a household budget, it's very hard to run a household budget if you are dependent on an illicit income for half of it and the other part on your neighbor's handouts or friends' handouts from across the sea. That also means that the entire military budget of about $2 billion a year, $2 to $4 billion a year of the Afghan security forces is funded externally by the United States and NATO allies. What does it, however, mean if we stop funding? If, for example, Congress decides that it's time to liquidate the war completely? Well, it means that over 350,000 soldiers will not be paid, will likely not continue fighting the Taliban, and in fact might turn to predatory behavior. Third aspect of the big question of what the Afghan army will look like is the ethnic cleavages that give Afghanistan a very rich flavor and a wonderful, diverse place to visit, but that also are the source of many of its problems. And much of the past decade has moderated some of the ethnic divisions, but much of the decade has also increased some of them. And indeed, what's been very palpable on the last trips over the past 2-3 years, every time I went to Afghanistan, the level of ethnic tensions and uncertainties would be palpably greater and will be palpably inserted into conversations very, very rapidly. And so the one big question for the army, for the military services, is will they hold together in the spirit of one country, fighting against those who try to bring the country back to the oppression and Middle Ages, the Taliban, or will they splinter along ethnic lines and make their own decisions and accommodations, perhaps return to the very vicious and bloody civil war of the early 1990s. The second earthquake is the economic earthquake, which is coming. Because not only will inevitably some parts of foreign aid disappear, the fewer the number of foreign troops, the lesser aid packages. That's a very unfortunate reality. Nonetheless, that's a reality. And also, critically, many jobs for the young generation of Afghans, people who have really grown up and came to forth over the past decade, have obtained employment in various services associated with the presence of foreign forces and the international community, whether as drivers, translators, cultural advisors in hotels, in Kabul, and a variety of other functions. And all of these jobs will evaporate essentially overnight. In a country that is over 50% under 25, that has a big youth bulge, and that has now, as a result of the presence of foreign forces, a very educated young population compared to the 1990s, where education completely bottomed out. But none of these people, or most of these people, will have no opportunity to find a job, even as they have an education. Afghanistan is potentially a very rich country. There is maybe $1 trillion US dollars worth of mineral resources underneath the Afghan dust. But before they can be extracted, there needs to be a far more effective security in the country, and there needs to be far more effective rule of law. Because with the existing corruption, foreign companies find it just too impossible to invest and extract resources, even foreign companies that are normally not very scrupulous as to where they engage. And the final earthquake is an earthquake that is also perhaps the greatest chance that Afghanistan has to come out of the slide that it's been experiencing and to take advantage, as still yet, of the relative stability and the economic investment, the foreign engagement, and launch itself of a path of of a renewal. And that's the presidential elections that are coming this year. If the elections go well, if they are reasonably acceptable to the Afghan people, and note that I didn't say free and fair, which would be ideal, but if they are reasonably acceptable to the Afghan people, and they produce a leader that recognizes that without greater legitimacy of the regime, without greater focus on the needs of the Afghan people, without a more effective and somewhat more accountable, at least, provision of services to the population, Afghanistan has really no chance of coming out of its mires and difficulties. There is a chance that things will improve yet. But it's also possible that the elections will not go this way, that they will in fact be the first trigger of violence and potentially the first trigger of civil war. And should that happen, that will also undermine any remaining wherewithal in the United States and in NATO partner countries in continue to be engaged robustly, including militarily, in Afghanistan. I'm often asked to tell our policymakers, as well as by friends, what I think will happen. And I tell them that the future of Afghanistan is not predetermined. Lots of trends are not auspicious, but nonetheless there are glimmers of hope. Whether it's some of the most impressive and courageous young Afghan people who have been willing not only to fight for their country, but take on the power brokers, and who have been willing through very peaceful means and mobilization of civil society to challenge both the Taliban and the abuse that has taken place. And there are also sort of other members of Afghanistan. It's a place of extremes and contradictions, but it's a place that easily gets underneath one's skin. And a story that I recount to some extent in the book is, I think, quite emblematic of the potentials and struggles and contradictions and wonders of Afghanistan. I was a few years ago traveling to the northern part of Afghanistan, one of the provinces called Baghlan. It's in the north. One has to climb over the Salang Pass. It's a beautiful, really gorgeous drive, and it's like going on a roller coaster, except there are no safeties. And the whole road is littered with car trucks that go back to the 1980s when the Mujahideen were blowing up the Soviet trucks, but many of which are very recent accidents. There's also a tremendous amount of there are also Taliban attacks and criminal attacks along the road. So you go on it, often it can take 15 hours, and you hold your breath. Will you make it across or not? And how long will you stay awake? And the Afghans tend to drive as if they were all Jedi Knights, so you just go forth no matter what, and you hope that someone else will swerve. And so we made it across the Salang on quite a harrowing drive, I must say. And we're going further north in an area very much contested between the Taliban, anti-Taliban militias, criminal elements, very insecure area. And I had arranged with the power broker that he would meet with us and facilitate access to where I wanted to interview some of the anti-Taliban militias. Who, by the way, were in fact former Taliban members, and today maybe they have reverted back to being Taliban members. And for me, that meant I would travel in Afghan clothes and in a burqa on a project like that, and there would be lots of security check-in and very high risk of kidnapping, not just for me, but security repercussions for my translator and drivers. So we arrive at the place where we are supposed to meet. And we're waiting and waiting. I'm in the car. I cannot risk going out of the car. The power broker is not showing up. And time's passing. We all become very nervous. The longer I stay, the greater the chance that a kidnapping or attack will be organized. At some point, we try calling the man, and his cell phone is off. He's not responding. So we make the decision. It's too risky. We have to get out. We have to get out quickly. Now, at this point, and by the way, we were counting on staying at his house for the night. And no power broker means no house for the night. My translator and driver could perhaps try to find some local housing, but there are no hotels where I can go, and I cannot just show up in someone's house. I cannot sleep in the car. If someone found a woman sleeping in the car, that would be highly problematic, highly insecure. So we're thinking, what can we do? Do we have to drive at night? Driving at night is very risky, lots of kidnapping possibilities, IEDs are being laid, chance of Taliban attacks, massive. If you're sane, you don't travel at night. And so I decided to call up a man that we had interviewed the day before. He was an important, influential man, and the interview was very, very difficult. And he was very hostile toward the US, clearly blaming the US for the corruption, insecurity, even suggesting that it was reasonable that people supported the Taliban. And so we called him up, and I said, I don't know what to do. Can you suggest anywhere where I can sleep, which in itself was a big risk. And he essentially said, come to my house. And I spent the night at his house. And it was just extraordinarily gesture, because the fact that he accepted a Western woman could easily expose him to Taliban retaliation and attacks. But I think it was very typical of the hospitality and the harshness, the huge limitations and oppression of women that's not just the Taliban, but that is deeply ingrained in the culture. And yet, at the same time, willingness to take great risks on behalf of a stranger, including a stranger that one is not very friendly toward, or a stranger who he believes comes from a country that has not behaved very well. And not only did I spend the night there, he in fact organized several Pashtun men who shared a meal with me. That's not at all what they would do with their women, and none of the women in the household participated. And then we had a very robust, not easy, but robust discussion for hours about politics, counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. And when I was leaving the next day, when I was leaving his house, he was putting on, and I was putting on the shoes that I left in front of the house. And he said, you know, when you Americans leave, the country will be so insecure that people will not even dare leave their shoes outside. It is your responsibility to make sure that things are not as dire as that. With that, let me open it for questions.
Is there any connection between the Taliban and the former Mujahideen?
Yes, absolutely. In many ways than just one. So some of the Taliban are in fact people who were fighting as part of the many Mujahideen factions in the 1980s against the Soviet Union. So some members are in fact identical, including some commanders that were the favorite US commanders and received lots of US support. There is another connection, and that is that the Taliban also reacted to and emerged out of the anarchy and chaos of the early 1990s, the period immediately after the end of, after the Soviet withdrawal, where the Mujahideen faction fought not only with the communist supporters and the communist government, but also turned on each other and engaged in very much of a bloodbath, and brought about a very vicious civil war. Easily 3 million people died. No one quite knows the numbers very well. And the power brokers would be very abusive, very capricious. So the Taliban at the time emerged with the explicit purpose of cleansing the country from the abuse and installing stability, and largely succeeded in that through very brutal means, but nonetheless succeeded in that. And that's something that people still bring as why the Taliban could be so entrenched in the country.
Ethnically, do you have the Sunni Shiite split in Afghanistan as severe as in, let's say, Iraq and Syria? And the other question I would have, certainly the Shiite Revolutionary Guard out of Iran rather, has their eye on that turmoil in northern Iraq. Are they also looking east toward potential territory and influence in, I can't quite picture the geography, but it perhaps would be
in Western Afghanistan, in fact.
Yes, Western Afghanistan.
Yes, indeed. So there is a Sunni-Shia split. The Shia groups are the Hazaras, an ethnic minority that has produced some of the most educated and abroad well-known Afghans, but a group that has suffered great discrimination and oppression, including at the hands of the Taliban, which for not just ethnic but also sectarian reasons were very vicious toward the Hazaras. So yes, it's there. and it's being manifested, unfortunately, in very detrimental ways. Iran, just like all of Afghan neighbors and countries in the surroundings, are paying very keen attention to what's happening in Afghanistan, and they have long been deeply involved in multiple ways. Many Afghan refugees went not just to Pakistan, but also to Iran. At one point, there would easily be 3 million diaspora of Afghans in Iran. The border is rather porous. People still go to Iran for jobs that they cannot get in Afghanistan. And Iran has keenly tried to influence politics and security in the country. During the 1990s, it supported the Northern Alliance against the Taliban, along with India and Russia, whereas Pakistan supported the Taliban. And today, the Hazaras, the Shias, are also, of course, religiously aligned with Iran, and Iran continues to be heavily focused on the Hazara community. But it's also sought to build very close relations with the Ark Palace. Highly unfortunately, the only person, or one of the few people that President Karzai seems to be listening to, is an advisor who is by many believed to be essentially an Iranian agent and very much influencing the president in ways that might serve Iran's interest. Iran does not want the United States to stay in Afghanistan, but are highly unhappy, are highly detrimental for the country. That said, Iran in the early 2001-2002 period played a very constructive role. They enabled some of the key brokering in Afghanistan in the December 2001 Berlin conference. And in fact, it was Iran diplomacy and suggestion that insisted that Afghanistan be a democracy, not an authoritarian regime, or the regime simply handed that over to a leader. So very much involved. Unfortunately, increasingly, many of the influence, much of the influence coming from Iran has not been highly useful, but they fundamentally oppose the Taliban.
Just a quick follow-up. The New Yorker had a long piece, I don't know if you happened to read it, I think it was this last issue, on Obama. And my interpretation, the enormous confusion, as you pointed out, in the White House, almost a paralysis. They don't know what to do. And I sometimes get a feeling that America is involved in a spot where we get into short wars that turn out to be so long and torturous. And then add to it, you get a feeling Obama rather seems to conduct war by drone attacks. Rather than not, and who knows, maybe that's a postmodern approach to war these days. But it just raises all kinds of moral questions, the civilian deaths.
And it raises also, in my mind, very much questions of efficacy and efficacy of policy. You know, I'm not surprised that the mood in decision-making circles, the mood in Congress is never again, just like that was the mood in Vietnam. And in the military itself, there is lots of soul-searching about whether counterinsurgency, which became the favorite doctrine under General Petraeus in the mid-2000s, was a completely failed concept that should never have been amazed. I think that the reality is that US policy goes through cycles, and in some ways cycles that are quite unhealthy. We tell ourselves we'll never do something again, and then because we have so many interests, we end up being pulled there, but then have forgotten all the lessons of what we have done, all the things that we should be prepared in how we get engaged, and we miss an opportunity. Afghanistan, in my view and in the book, is very much a story of missed opportunities and wrong decisions taken, and they were not to do that we tried to do too much, but that we tried to do too little. But what the president was in fact articulating yesterday was very much a vision of very limited intervention, quick in and out, fly-by intervention, including by remote platforms.
Yes, it's interesting, at least they had like a Loya Jirga in Afghanistan in some process. Do you foresee also that there will be any process here that actually involves the president and the Congress? And it was very interesting that Obama almost all of a sudden decided to have Congress have some debate on Syrian operations after Britain did. Do you see, even Britain, or do you see us or Britain or anyone else having like a real debate and discuss some of these issues in the open?
I think that part of it is the responsibility of the executive. Much of it is the responsibility of the legislative branch. They should be the ones taking interest, debating policies, grilling the administration, and demanding more concrete answers. And the general context, both here in Europe, is tiredness. The support among the public is very limited. That's partially driven by, I think, highly inaccurate stories about Afghanistan, which often are simply about the negative, or conversely, try to portray the picture to be so rosy that they become completely incredible and people dismiss them. And the nuance and complexities and the opportunities that one has to work with and to foster are often missed in those discussions. But as much as it is one of the US longest war, it's also a war that, despite the large number of US troops, could also be extremely limited. I mean, many people really didn't, unless they knew someone who was directly in the military deployed, that they didn't felt in any way connected. And that's partially, I think, a failure of leadership on both the executive and the legislative branch, which should have insisted on far more engagement, either far more support, or if they themselves lost confidence in the project, then in debate and discussion.
Yes, this pattern repeats all the time, starting with the Native Americans and the way we treated them, on through today, and through trampling through 50, 100 countries, and creating the same chaos everywhere. We tend to view ourselves as great saviors, and then when anyone protests, all of a sudden we become these great victims, and you've expressed that very well, how we're basically victims. If you take the things that you've attributed to the Taliban and multiplied it times 100 times, we would have some idea of how the United States conducts itself all over the world. We're not even safe in our own country. Every communication is being watched. Every police force is being converted into a military force. I
actually would not suggest that and hope that didn't come across in the presentation. I think that policy has been tormented and made lots of mistakes. But to in any way suggest that our behavior is equivalent to the Taliban, I think it's just blatantly false. The Taliban lays bombs and doesn't mind killing women and children in score, doesn't mind who it assassinates.
Do you know how we treated the Native Americans?
Well, that is certainly the case, and it's a hugely unfortunate part of history, and one that we need to be accountable for, but that's not how we have behaved at all in Afghanistan. So I think that the comparison to suggest that our engagement is anyway like the Taliban's or worse is just blatantly not the case. Have we made mistakes? Yes. Have we caused civilian casualties? Yes.
The drones, the conduct of the war, our behavior in Iraq, our behavior in Vietnam, killing 3 million people, Chile,
we get your perspective. Allow me to give other people a chance.
I'm taking a little bit of control here so that we can respect the audience and have a few more questions addressed. Please.
Sure. The gentleman here.
What is the structure of the Taliban power, and is there any structure with which there could be any negotiation for ceasefire or lowering of hostility?
Excellent question. Indeed, one of the things that is most impressive, arguably, about the Taliban insurgency is its leadership capacity and the ability to maintain strong, hierarchical, effective leadership for essentially 2 decades, including through very intense US counterinsurgency response, very much focused on eliminating key Taliban commanders. Now, The reality is that the top Taliban leadership has been in exile in Pakistan under very comfortable conditions, provided safe havens by the Pakistani intelligence services over the past decade, and largely unreachable unreachable by U.S. Forces or Afghan forces, and something that's hugely angering the Afghan government. And over the past several years, especially the past last year, the thrust has been, the thrust of policy has been to try to negotiate with the Taliban and to come to some negotiated agreement. Now that strand of policy recognizes that the Taliban is not identical with Al-Qaeda, and it assumes that if a deal is struck, the Taliban will respect the deal and will in fact not go to its old ways of providing safe havens for Al-Qaeda. It's a question that yet remains to be seen should a deal be struck. But the reality is that the Taliban has not been interested in negotiations. In June of last year, the Taliban opened a big office in Doha with cameras and TVs that completely shocked the Afghan people and the Afghan government, and they pulled out of negotiation. The Taliban has subsequently not been very much interested in engaging. And essentially, there is split in the leadership. Some believe that negotiations will be inevitable. By and large, the Taliban believes that they will get a much better negotiated deal in 2015 or on. And particularly if no US forces are present, they can milk far greater concessions, retake far more territory, and be much stronger at the negotiating table. So even to get a good deal with the Taliban, some presence of US forces will help. But frankly, I don't expect that negotiations could get on in a meaningful way before 2015, 2016. And they will only take place if the Taliban confronts the Afghan security forces and finds them not buckling. Essentially, we need to get to a point where either side realizes that they will not be a military victory, and then they need to start to negotiate and think about how to live in the country together. But it's not just the government and the Taliban. You have ethnic minorities like the Tajiks who are frightened by the prospect of negotiation with the Taliban. Civil society is deeply ambivalent. Women groups are often opposed because they're afraid that negotiations will mean going back on women's rights, and perhaps it might even mean the kind of oppressive restrictions of the 1990s.
Thank you. In reference to today, the Sharif said that he would like to have peaceful negotiations, and the Taliban spokesperson said that he would consider it and it would go to the Shura. Is this just another ploy so they can eventually or hopefully release more prisoners?
Well, I think that what you are actually referring to is not negotiations with the Afghan Taliban, although that's also something that Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif has endorsed, but negotiations with the Pakistani Taliban. The two groups are separate. They have different objectives. Pakistani Taliban tries to take over Pakistan. The Afghan Taliban tries to take over Afghanistan. They interact with each other but are not identical. They have been largely supportive of each other, but again, they are two different groups with two different objectives. And so there are two different peace processes being talked about. One peace process is the Afghanistan one, which involves principally the United States and the international community, the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban, but in which Pakistan plays a crucial role because Pakistan provides safe haven and has under their thumb the Afghan Taliban leadership. A completely separate process from that is negotiations between the Pakistani government, Pakistani military, and the Pakistani Taliban groups. The US has now embraced the first negotiations, although it's been very frustrated, but continues to be deeply ambivalent about Pakistani negotiations with Pakistani Taliban, believing they are just a mirage, that Pakistani Taliban will continue conducting terrorist attacks and will continue threatening the United States and U.S. Allies and U.S. Assets and continue providing safe havens for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed.
Is there any like residual, any type of Russian involvement in the area still, or?
Well, Russia is very much involved, so far mainly on the political side. It, just like many a country in the neighborhood, it cultivates its friends and proxies in the political system, particularly those who are close to Russia, but there is no Russian military involvement at all in the country, and frankly, I doubt that it would be welcome. However, should another civil war come, should the country not hold together, just like in the 1990s, Russia, Iran, China, India, the United States would sponsor the power brokers, the factions that they believe would most promote their interests. And President Karzai's tactic for a number of years has been to try to play and divide on the international arena. Whenever there is NATO pressure on him to act, for example, against corruption that almost brought down the entire financial system of Afghanistan, he flies to Russia or to China and has photographs taken with President Putin saying, see, I don't have to listen to you, I have new friends.
We have time for last question. Who would you like
Let me
to?
take it over there, the
Please.
lady in the back.
Thanks for your lecture, by the way. We really appreciate it. I had an opportunity to be in Afghanistan in 1972. It was just before the king was overthrown in Pakistan. And it struck me at the time that, perhaps not that much different today, but the government had effective control over the cities, but the rural areas were pretty much tribal. And I guess my question is there a possibility in the future that Afghanistan would even break up? It's kind of an artificial creation. The what around Herat seems to be more oriented towards the Iranians.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that a...
Well, the reality is that government control in the cities is far greater than in the rural areas. Now, what's very different from the time when you were there is that the vast majority of the population now lives in the urban areas, in fact, close to between 70 and 80% of people. That has its own problems, including access to jobs and the provision of infrastructure in a way that's felt far more acutely and generates problems far more than if one was living in dispersed villages in the countryside. But it also means, on the other hand, that there is greater government access to these people and greater control. Do I believe that Afghanistan could break up? Well, I think actually not easily. And I don't think that Afghanistan is so much of an artificial creation. Many an African country is. But although Afghanistan has many different ethnic groups and many different tribes under those ethnic groups, there is an identity as one being Afghan. In fact, it's quite easy to, if you meet someone for the first time and do not know from the way he or she is dressed what ethnic group they belong to, if you ask them what tribe you belong to, people get very angry. They find the question quite offensive, really. And it's very sort of delicate balance how one approaches that. And whether you talk with people in the Taliban or supporting the Taliban or people opposing the group, just about no one wants the country to break up.
I was thinking of part of the Pathans, because they are in northern Pakistan too.
And these dreams of sort of greater Pashtunistan are sort of there, but also not really taken seriously. There's a lot of Afghan resentment toward Pakistan, actually. So no one wants breakup, and the contestation has historically been not over this part of the territory would secede, but over who controls Kabul and how much power Kabul has. And so what might emerge should the unfortunate outcome of civil war repeat itself, one would likely see sort of pockets of territory being held by different groups, and perhaps even a Taliban line holding most of the south and the east, and other groups holding other parts. But I would, even under these circumstances, I would really not expect people to secede. In the 1990s, the Northern Alliance continued fighting on and saying, no, we are Afghanistan, or we are as much Afghanistan, and they never decided to declare the Northern Tajik area a separate country. Let me give one last chance to the lady over there.
Absolutely.
My question is, especially because you've studied Afghanistan for so long, we've seen that problems with areas like Afghanistan, where they do have a tribal background, usually don't want to shape to a westernized way of setting up a government. Now, how is U.S. policy going to be successful if the political system has failed institutions? It's not really institutionalized. Therefore, even if we try to set up elections, the electorate's not working, the judicial system's not institutionalized. Any institution within the nation, it's not working properly. So how can U.S. policy be successful within the country, even in the future years? Let's say we stay
right, I'm getting the
the
question. Many institutions function problematically, but it's also not true that there are no institutions and that they don't function at all. The military is functioning quite well, given where it has come from. The Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health, including in its local presence, is doing surprisingly well from two entities that were completely destroyed, where no human capital and just about no physical infrastructure was left in 2001 after the decades of the civil war, the anti-Soviet insurgency in the Taliban era. It's also true that institutions don't emerge out of thin air. You don't wake up one day and say, wonderful America, we have institutions. It's a process. If you look at European institutional formation and the European state, it's very much emerged out of conditions that are not quite like Afghanistan today, in back the 12th, 13th century. So it takes time, and there are many contingent factors, but it's not true to say that there is nothing to work with and that the people are inevitably against it. And I go back to what I was suggesting. This notion of tribalism is only one facet of what Afghans are like. At the end of the day, they are just like any people anywhere in the world. They want security and they want accountability. And apart from the state institutions, the central state institutions that have become warped and captured, and yes, that are extremely politicized and that are extremely about individual networks, but in the sense they are no different than institutions in Nepal, institutions in Pakistan, and institutions in India, which are very much about individual patronage networks rather than other forms of contestation. There is a chance that they'll advance, that they'll continue. And even in the tribal ways, there were institutions, such as Loya Jirga, meetings of elders. Some form of institutions has emerged because no one wants to live in chaos. Now, the difficulty is that many of these tribal and traditional institutions were destroyed in the 80s, were destroyed by the Civil War. And then, and it was this destruction, the collapse of the traditional institution, that allowed the Taliban to be so successful in the 1990s. But if you go back to the early 2000s, and even today, it's not that people don't want state institutions. It's not that they don't want a functioning judiciary. They don't have it, and that's what they resent, that the institutions have not formed sufficiently. And I go back to what I was suggesting. It's not that we failed because we could not do it. We haven't properly tried. Now, it might be too late at this point. The window of opportunity was great in 2001, 2003, 2002, 2003. It might not open again. But it's also just wrong to say that there are no institutional formation has taken place, and that will always be the case.
Thank you, Vanda. Thank you. I always really do hate to draw our discussion to a close. As I promised all our scholars, I knew we'd have a great discussion, a lively discussion, and you certainly lived up to the reputation our audience has earned thank you for coming and for your participation. Hope you can join us next week. We'll have another Brookings colleague out, Neil Ruiz. We'll be out. Neil's an expert on international immigration, particularly with an emphasis on how it affects the global economy and in large metropolitan areas, of which we happen to be in one. So it has a lot of relevance. I hope you can join us. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.